domestic violence, terrorism, terrorism, domestic violence, violence, terrorism, violence, terrorism, domestic violence, terrorism, violence, violence, domestic violence, terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, 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 domestic terrorism, domestic violence, violence, domestic million violence, terrorism, violence, violence,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorist threat, terrorism, terrorism, violence, domestic terrorism, terrorism, domestic terrorism, 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 domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism.
For investigating programs, indeed, terrorism, domestic terrorism, terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic violence, domestic violence, domestic terrorism, domestic violence, domestic terrorism, terrorism, domestic
violence, domestic terrorism, domestic
violence, domestic violence, domestic violence, terrorism, violence, terrorism,
violence,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, violence,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, terrorism,
million terrorism, violence,
terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, violence, domestic terrorism, violence, domestic terrorism, violence,
terrorism, million, domestic terrorism, million, domestic terrorism, million, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic
terrorism, domestic terrorism,
violence, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
million violence, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
violence,